Namaste, my dear brothers and sisters, boys and girls. It's really a wonderful, thrilling and exciting feeling to be able to communicate and get together day after day, in spite of all the distance and everything involved. And in spite of the distance and the mode of communication, it seems there's a community sort of building up of like-minded people who are enjoying this process of sharing in a spirit of being the mother's instruments for taking the world to a towards a higher level of consciousness, towards a better world. So that is the spirit in which we seem to be meeting day after day. It's a bright and sunny morning here in Delhi, and I hope you all have good weather. Coming to distances, my right hand, Aditi Kaul, is not by my right hand side today as usual, but she is a few hundred kilometers away from here in Jaipur. And yet we are able to run the session. That again is a marvel of technology. So in a way, this development in technology also seems to be a development that is taking the world in that direction. That one world feeling, is getting not just something which is a wishful thinking or a sentimental idea, but something which is translating into a reality. And that is the way one can look at the developments in technology, which have been further accelerated, and the possibilities of which we have been made more aware of by the coronavirus pandemic. In this course that is going on, we are now on the schools of yoga, and after getting introduced to Hatha Yoga, now we are on to Raja Yoga. Last time we did the first of the 8 limbs of Raja Yoga, that is Niyamas. Today we'll go to the second limb, that is Niyamas. And for that, I'll have to turn to the screen. Rather, sharing the screen with you. The love and blessings of the Mother and Sri Aurobindo to all of you from Sri Aurobindo Ashram Delhi branch. Here we have added to this a few sentences related to yoga, education, and spirituality. Yoga is education. Education is incomplete without spirituality, and spirituality in practice is what yoga is. So today our session is on Niyamas, or the rules as given in the second limb of the Ashtanga of Patanjali's yoga. So yoga is a journey towards self-perfection of both the physical and the mental parts of the being. The school that emphasizes physical perfection is Hatha Yoga. The school that emphasizes mental perfection is Raja Yoga. Now, both these parts of the being, physical and mental, are manifestations of the divine and are able to function because of the life force or prana, which animates both the gross manifestation, that is the body, and the subtle manifestation, the mind. It animates both so that they are able to manifest a small fraction of the consciousness of the Supreme. However, this manifestation remains imperfect, and the journey of yoga is about taking this manifestation from its state of imperfection and ignorance towards a state of perfection and higher knowledge. And that can happen in this hierarchy of manifestation by the higher manifestation, that is the manifestation that manifests more of the divine, influencing the one that manifests less of it. And in Hatha Yoga, what essentially happens is that the life force or the vital or the prana influences the body, illumines the body in such a way that now the body can be liberated from its limitations. In fact, it seems as if the body is yearning to come out of these limitations, because the restlessness of the body is because it is not able to manifest the prana fully. The prana can provide it much more possibilities than the body is actually able to manifest. It has limitations such as inertia, which manifests as laziness, and also decay and degeneration, which leads to aging in the organism. Now, these are limitations which the body is as if anxious to overcome, and that is why that restlessness. As the prana starts manifesting more, as the prana animates this body further, what happens is this restlessness gradually comes down, and the body is able to manifest the divinity more. It ages slowly. It is less likely to fall ill, and if it does fall ill, the recovery becomes much faster. Prana, or the life force, being the bridge between the body and the mind, also prepares the adhara, or the base, or the material foundation for the mind, that is the nervous system, and thereby makes it possible for the force or the level of consciousness even higher than the mind to influence the mind, and then the mind can overcome its limitations. So what essentially happens in Hatha Yoga is that the life force illumines the body, including the nervous system, which is the material counterpart of the mind, and the mind then is ready to receive the influence of the soul. It's able to communicate more of that higher consciousness because of the transformation that has been brought about by the vital, by making the nervous system now fit to receive that greater fraction of the divine consciousness from the soul. And the result is that when the soul illumines the mind is liberated from its limitations. The mind has two aspects, feeling and thinking, and both those limitations, the limitations of both these parts of the being, the feeling part and the thinking part, can be transcended when the mind is under the influence of the soul, particularly its dynamic aspect, the psychic being. Now, what are the weaknesses or the limitations of the feeling part? The weakness is that the feelings are drawn towards what feels good right here and now. But what feels good right here and now is not necessarily good for us. It's summed up in two rhyming brief words in Sanskrit, Shreyas and Preyas. Shreyas is what is really good for us, and Preyas is what feels good. So what feels good, or Preyas, is not necessarily Shreyas. And that becomes a weakness. But then through the process of yoga, when the soul illumines the mind, what is Shreyas, that is what is really good for us, also becomes Preyas, which means start liking it. So that is the type of change it can bring about. Now, what are the weaknesses of the thinking part of the being? The thinking part of the being is meant to moderate and govern the idiosyncrasies of the feeling part. So, this tendency to get drawn towards what may not be good for us can be checked by the intellect, the thinking part of the being, because it knows better than the feeling part what is good and what is bad for us. But then the influence of the feelings is so powerful that instead of the thinking part being able to moderate the feelings end up exploiting the intellect, and the intellect finds reasons, invents reasons, which it is very easily able to do what the feeling part wants it to do. So in other words, what Sri Aurobindo says is that the one who was meant to be the leader ends up being the follower. So the leader, that is the intellect, actually ends up following the feelings or the emotional part of the being. So the relationship gets reversed. But when under the influence of the soul, the thinking part does not anymore do so, because now it has a guide. It is a guide available in the psychic being, the dynamic aspect of the soul. And therefore, it is more clear about what the right thing to do is, and therefore it cannot be exploited. So while both these parts are being influenced by the soul, the feeling and the thinking part, the feeling part gradually starts realizing that what is really good for us, that is Shreyas, can also become Preyas, and in fact can give us greater joy than the fleeting pleasures towards which it is normally drawn. So with this transformation, it becomes more and more habitual for the feeling part to get drawn towards what is good and also enjoyable. And then the intellect, as it is getting transformed by under the influence of the soul, by getting illumined by the soul, also starts inventing only those reasons which would justify what is really good for us. And that is how a unification of the feeling part, the thinking part, and the soul is achieved. So that is what Raja Yoga is essentially about. The classic text of Raja Yoga are the Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, on which a translation and commentary is available by none other than Swami Vivekananda. under the title Rajayoga, Conquering of Internal Nature. So Raja Yoga, Patanjali's yoga, and Ashtanga yoga are essentially synonymous. Ashtanga referring to the 8 limbs into which Patanjali has divided yoga. And these 8 limbs are Yama or restraints, which we talked about in the previous session, Niyama or the rules, which we'll be talking about today, and Asana, Pranayama, Pratyahara, Dharana, and Dhyana, which give us the technique of meditation, which we shall talk about when we go to meditation. And Samadhi is the product of the previous 7 limbs. So let's now turn to recapitulate once again what the 5 yamas are. That is the 5 restraints. Ahimsa, which means non-violence. Satya, truth, looks positive, but what it means is not telling a lie. Asteya, non-stealing. Brahmacharya, which literally means movement towards the divine, and that happens as a result of not having attachment to sensory pleasures. Aparigraha, not adding to possessions. So these are the 5 yamas or the restraints. Now coming to niyama or the rules. That is the second limb of the Ashtanga or Patanjali's yoga. Now here there's a general statement Sri Aurobindo has made, which I find very educative. A rule that can be varied by everyone at his pleasure is no rule. It applies not only to the niyamas here, but also to rules in general. The law of the land, for example, it applies also to that. So a rule that can be varied by everyone at his pleasure is no rule. And one of the rules of Ashtanga is that we should make a beginning with yama and niyama, and then only go to the subsequent limbs. But there's a tendency to sometimes feel that, well, one can do the asanas without doing yamas and niyamas. And some people, in fact, one can meditate without worrying about yamas and niyamas, meditate regularly, and that will take care of a lot of problems in life. And some even have the ambition of going into samadhi without bothering about the previous 7 limbs. Now, the rule, one of the rules is that we can't go to the next limb without thinking about the previous one. And this is a rule which cannot be varied by everyone at his pleasure, because of how the process does not work through concessions to individuals. There are no concessions and there are no exceptions when it comes to this journey. Now in the niyamas or the rules, the first is shaucha. Shaucha or cleanliness. And it can be outer cleanliness or inner cleanliness. Outer cleanliness would refer to cleanliness of the body, our immediate surroundings, that is the house. Still further, cleanliness of our city and town and so on, neighborhood, and not forgetting cleanliness of the planet as a whole, taking care of the environment. So all that can come under outer cleanliness. And then inner cleanliness, that is cleaning up our thoughts and feelings. Let's concentrate on outer cleanliness first. Now, when we talk about keeping the outer surroundings clean, body and dress one can understand. How about the house? Now, how can we clean the house? By getting rid of what is not required, apart from, of course, dusting and mopping and so on. But then one of the important aspects of this outer cleanliness is not trying to have more than is necessary. Because if we have a house much bigger than we need, then what would happen is that it will take more time and effort to keep it clean. And since a lot of stuff that we are storing in this house is not really necessary, it will get relegated to rooms which are not visited much. And therefore, we'll have more and more of storerooms which are full of junk. And somehow we manage to keep a small part of it, which is used regularly, clean. And particularly the place where we get visitors. Now, what we are trying to do is create on the visitors an impression of being much more clean than we really are. So in a way, we are violating Satya, which is one of the yamas. And all for nothing. So one of the things of keeping anything clean is to have less to look after. Secondly, also, what is important outer cleanliness is to keep what we have and what is really necessary in an organized manner. So everything should have a place, and everything should be at the right place as far as possible all the time. And this applies to everything, including drawers and shelves, which are not easily visible. So once again, it's not because we want to present an outer appearance of cleanliness, but it should be genuine cleanliness, which helps our mind also stay uncluttered. And on the other hand, an uncluttered mind leads to a better organization of our outer material. In fact, the mother has said that if you look at the way a person organizes his drawer or his outer surroundings, you can get an idea of how well organized he is in his or her mind. So the way we are organized in our mind reflects in our outer surroundings. Now coming to inner cleanliness, that is cleanliness of our thoughts and feelings. Once again, the same principle applies. Say, if we start with thoughts, we have a very heavy traffic of thoughts coming and going through the mind all the time. But if we reflect upon it, we would find that much of those thoughts are totally unnecessary. And therefore, one of the first things we can do is to classify the thoughts into what are necessary and unnecessary, worth retaining and not worth retaining, and try and eliminate those thoughts which are not necessary. So once again, a process of conscious, selective elimination. And then whatever thoughts remain, organize them properly. So that would give us an inner cleanliness so far as thoughts are concerned. And what about the feelings? We are full of so many feelings, and many of them quite negative. And what we can do is to eliminate those feelings. In case of feelings, elimination alone may not work and may not be the most desirable thing to do, because we can't become totally bereft of feelings. And there cannot be a vacuum created by getting rid of the negative feelings. What is really helpful and what should happen on the path of progress is that these negative feelings should get replaced by their opposites, which are positive in nature. And that would mean sort of an inner cleanliness. So replacing the negative feelings by positive feelings, and then finally retaining those feelings which are the most essential. And we shall see how that can happen. Now, what are the major negative feelings? These have been summed up in traditional literature in the form of Shadripu, or the 6 enemies. And these 6 enemies are Kama, that is desires, Krodha, anger, Lobha, greed, Moha, attachment, Ahankar, arrogance, and Matsara, jealousy. And what are their opposites? The opposite of desires is contentment. That is being happy with what we have. And the opposite of anger is forgiveness. Opposite of greed is again contentment. And the opposite of attachment is non-attachment. That is not being attached, which is a byproduct of many of the other things that are happening, because forceful detachment is difficult. Non-attachment comes from getting attached to something higher. So we can get detached from or reach a state of non-attachment to something lower if we get attached to something higher. So that is the process. And Ahankar, arrogance, the opposite is humility. And the opposite of jealousy is oneness, because jealousy is an expression of feeling me versus somebody else. Why don't I have this? Somebody else has this. This is something that I possess, but somebody else has taken it or is using it, and so on and so forth. So jealousy is essentially one of the most hurtful ways of expressing this feeling of separation, which is driven by our ego. And we are all under the influence of it to varying degrees, by and large. Elimination of the ego comes very late on the spiritual path. And therefore, but one of the worst expressions, but it doesn't mean that just because the ego has not been eliminated, we also have to be jealous. Jealousy is one of the most negative expressions of in this feeling of separation. And that is why in Hindi, it is expressed by one word, jalna. Jalna means burning. It is something which burns the individual. More than anybody else of whom we are jealous, it doesn't really do any harm to that other person. It burns us from within. So that is how bad it can be. But then I recently came across a word called compulsion. And what is compulsion? Jealousy is used most often in relation to sexual relationships. That is, a person can't tolerate that his partner is getting close to or enjoying the company of somebody else, generally of the other gender. So this is where jealousy is talked about most often. But these days, there is a new type of phenomenon emerging, which has been named compulsion. Compulsion is a word you will not still find in dictionaries, but it occurs in recent textbooks of psychology. And what is compulsion? A person knows that my partner is now getting close to somebody else, is enjoying that other person's company, probably enjoying that other person's company more than mine, but I'm happy for it that my partner is happy. So I'm happy because my partner is happy. That itself makes me happy. I'm not jealous. And that is compulsion. So it's a sort of a variation on compassion. And this is perhaps one of the finest and least expected results of the new emerging consciousness. That is the way we can look at it. So what Sri Aurobindo and the mother have talked about, a new consciousness emerging on the planet, is expressed by phenomena like this, which are so new that even new words have to be coined to describe them. And those words have still not even entered the dictionaries. So one of the finest and least expected results of this new emerging consciousness is compulsion. And it is this type of phenomena which will make the world a much better place to live in. To, again, a selection. Placing them with their opposites. In case of feelings, what the mother has said is there's really only one emotion worth retaining. And what is that? Love. And for whom? For the divine. And what about the rest? Should we not love human beings or the rest of the creation? For the rest, it is egoless kindness and goodwill. It's not that it's different from love, but this description, egoless kindness and goodwill, sums up what love is about without attachment. So it is, we can love the rest of the creation, but that has to be without attachment. And love without attachment probably can't be expressed better than through these words, egoless kindness and goodwill. So Shaucha or cleanliness is essentially about conscious elimination. Elimination of what we do not need in our surroundings, what we do not need in our thoughts, what we do not need in our feelings, and orderly organization of what is left, what is retained. So that is what Shaucha or cleanliness is about. And if we do that, we would find that the next niyama, that is santosh, which means contentment, would automatically follow. So in fact, the sequence is also very meaningful because if we have cleaned up our surroundings, we are trying to retain only as much as is necessary. We do not want to accumulate more because aparigraha, that is one of the yamas. Then it means that we are quite satisfied with what we have. We are not keen to get anything more. And that is what contentment is about. So contentment essentially boils down to overcoming desires. And why should we overcome them after they have been planted in us? Yes, they do have a limited purpose. And desire, in fact, is what has made survival possible. Desiring things like food and sex and so on is what has ensured survival of the individual and the species. So that is why they have been planted in us. But as human beings, we are more than feeding and breeding creatures. And therefore, not only we cannot be limited to catering to the desires of food and sex. As human beings, we have far more desires than animals have. We have a way of multiplying our desires. And therefore, for human beings who in fact want to go beyond feeding and breeding, it has become all the more important to control their desires, to overcome their desires. And one of the things that keeps adding to our desires is invention of more and more objects of desire. Animals don't invent those things and use them. It has been said that necessity is the mother of invention. The opposite is also true. Invention is the mother of necessity. The more the objects that are invented, the more they seem to be necessary. So that keeps on multiplying our desires. But then why should we overcome these desires? For a variety of reasons. Firstly, the pleasure that we get from the objects of desire, the pleasure that we get is a fleeting pleasure. It doesn't last very long. We've all experienced that, be it tasty food or be it sex, be it any such thing. the pleasure does not last very long. Secondly, it follows the law of saturation kinetics, which means that it is very pleasant to start with. Gradually, it starts becoming less and less attractive. And finally comes a point when we are saturated with it, we don't want it anymore. Suppose a person likes ice cream. If you give him ice cream morning, afternoon, and evening every day, it will not, probably the liking for ice cream will not last even a week. So we get saturated with it. That applies to all objects of desire. Thirdly, before the desire is fulfilled, we have a lot of expectations from it. We think it will make us very happy. Those expectations are seldom fulfilled. Why they are not fulfilled is because comes along with that object also something you can call a sort of a tax. So something unpleasant associated with it, which we had not visualized, generally accompanies the fulfillment of the desire. So that is another thing that makes desires a source of misery. Yet another source of misery because of the desires is that what we get attached to. And because we get attached to it, we become dependent on it for our happiness. We also develop a sense of insecurity because objects of desire will not last forever. We know it somewhere deep within, it will not last forever. So this question, how long will it last, becomes a source of insecurity. And finally, if a person is truly on the spiritual path, then one more disturbing feature comes. My desire has been fulfilled. Many others also have a similar desire, but their desire has not yet been fulfilled. So one starts feeling as if I'm cornering more than my share of resources and I'm being happy while ignoring somebody else's deprivation. Now, this feeling also becomes disturbing once the desire has been fulfilled. So these are the reasons, some of the reasons why desires, both fulfilled and unfulfilled, can be a source of misery. So it's not only unfulfilled desire, but even fulfilled desires can be a source of misery because of all these reasons, because of the fleeting character, because of the saturation, because of the price tag that comes with the thing, and because of getting attached and dependent on the object, because of a sense of insecurity, and because of the queasy, unpleasant feeling, others don't have it. Am I really entitled to enjoy it? So all these things make even fulfilled desires a source of misery. Now, how can we overcome desires? Not by knowing all that I have said so far. It's good to know it. It is also true, but it is not enough to overcome desires. Because all this remains theoretical knowledge till our own life has illustrated it. And how will it be illustrated? By fulfillment of a few desires. So if you tell a poor person, money is not everything in life, it will not bring you much happiness and so on and so forth, he'll say, okay, it may be so, but let me get some money, then I'll think about it. So first he wants to fulfill his desires. You tell a hungry person, food will not provide you lasting, I want food, I'm hungry, he'll scream. First give me food, then I'll see whether it'll give me happiness or it won't give me happiness. So some desires have to be fulfilled, which means that both are important. This knowledge is important and fulfillment of some desires is also important. When the desires have been fulfilled and the person has this knowledge, then the person finds that the fulfillment of the desire is confirming my knowledge. Now, when this knowledge is confirmed or verified by my own personal experience, it becomes genuinely my knowledge and my wisdom. And then it really means something to me. Then I start thinking about putting it into practice. So therefore, knowledge alone is not enough. Knowledge plus experience, which is obtained by fulfillment of the desires, translates into the type of wisdom which will eliminate some of the desires, and whatever desires are still left, the intensity of those desires will go down. And if some of those desires, the intensity of which is low, are not fulfilled, I'll not be affected because I'll know that, well, it has not been fulfilled, but then heavens will not fall if it's not affected. In any case, if it had been fulfilled, history would have repeated itself. And for some time, I would have been happy. And then again, I would have been unhappy. So, one understands this process. So if this has been repeated several times by fulfillment of a few desires, then this knowledge no longer just remains knowledge. It becomes internalized, it becomes a part of my personality, habitually start having fewer desires of low intensity, and the non-fulfillment of a desire does not become a source of misery or anxiety for me. So that is how one can overcome desires. So absence of desire or contentment is a process. It is not an event. It can't happen as a result of knowing a few things and saying that, well, from tomorrow, no desires. Can't happen. It's a gradual process. And a part of that process is the fulfillment of at least some desires. Now, but then does it apply to all the desires? As in case of feelings, the negatives can be replaced by their opposites. Here also, the less desirable desires can be replaced by desirable desires. And one desire, the desire for the divine, is something what yoga is all about. And because it is a desirable desire, we don't call it a desire, we call it an aspiration. So an aspiration is a desirable desire. And what should that aspiration be? The mother has given a beautiful answer in this prayer. Her prayer dated the 12th of March, 1914, which is there in the collection of her prayers and meditations. O Lord, my one aspiration is to know thee and serve thee better every day. So that is the one aspiration worth having, to know the divine and to serve the divine better every day. Day after day, I should serve better. I should be able to serve the divine better today than I did yesterday, and tomorrow better than today. That is the only one aspiration I have. That is the one aspiration worth having. And then she goes on to say in this, the same prayer, in this attitude lies supreme peace, perfect serenity, true contentment. Contentment or santosh is what we are talking about. So to get contented, the desires have to be overcome. And overcoming a desire brings much greater happiness than fulfilling a desire. That's again a very axiomatic sort of a truth. When it comes to worldly desires, overcoming a desire never brings as much joy as a conscious elimination of the desire, overcoming it by reflecting over its necessity. And it is only through elimination of the desires and retaining just that one aspiration to know the divine and to serve the divine better that we get not only peace and serenity, but we also get true contentment. And Patanjali has, again, in his sutras, two consecutive sutras, in the second section of the sutras, 41 and 42, in these two sutras, he says, purification, that is shaucha or cleanliness, leads to cheerfulness. So if our surroundings are clean, our mind is clean, we will be cheerful. But then contentment takes us one step further. From cheerfulness, contentment or santosh, that is the second yama, gives us superlative happiness. Superlative happiness or supreme peace, perfect serenity, true contentment. Now this is what we get from the second niyama, that is contentment. Gives superlative happiness, or what the mother has described as the supreme peace, perfect serenity. Now the third one, tapas. Tapas essentially means concentration of energy. We all have limited time and energy, and therefore, if we concentrate on what is really important to us, that would be called tapas. For example, if a student's exams are approaching and the student decides that for the sake of my career, this exam is far more important than spending time on social media, interacting with my friends, all types of useless gossip, exchanging gossip with them, this is much more important. The student gives that up. That is also a type of tapas. But then that type of tapas or elimination of what really is not going to contribute to our goal is also a part of the spiritual path, and that is what tapas is about. Very often tapas is translated as austerity. But austerity, in fact, is a poor translation of tapas, although there is some superficial similarity. Austerity is generally about an extreme simplification of life. And sometimes it is also used for a conscious self-torture. That is, not only reducing one's requirements, but also imposing some hardship on oneself consciously. For example, going on a prolonged fast, or deliberately exposing oneself to some discomfort, like extremes of heat and cold, and some of the ascetics have even tried to sleep on nails and so on and so forth. Now, these are all sometimes grouped under austerity. But austerity basically, literally actually means something which is just an extreme degree of simplicity, trying to do it as little as possible. Now, tapas also translates into it, but the spirit underlying the two is not the same. The motive is not necessarily the same. Tapas, you see, has a clear goal. And because of that goal, the person feels that whatever will not contribute to that goal, I can eliminate from my life. That will apply not only to thoughts and feelings, it will also apply to material objects. That is what Shocha is about. And the person will be contented with that little bit, and that is what Santosh is about. Now, so all these are following in a particular sequence. So the person will be left with only those possessions, those objects, and those thoughts and feelings which are contributing to the goal. So the person's energies are now concentrated because our energies are applied to what we are thinking about. So since our thoughts have been purified and only the thoughts worth retaining have been kept, our energy is being spent only on those thoughts, on giving an effect to what those thoughts are asking us to work for. So that becomes tapas. So our thoughts have been controlled. Our material objects are not necessary. We are contented. So the result is that there will be an extreme degree of simplicity, because this person also now is doing with very little that is absolutely necessary for his life. So that would be, but this motive behind these two simplicities is different, can be different. Now, what can be the motive behind an extreme degree of simplification in austerity as compared to tapas? Tapas is just concentration of energy, and simplification of life follows as a corollary. In austerity, the focus itself is on simplicity. Now, the motive in austerity may not always be applying oneself to a worthwhile goal, applying all energies or using all the energy for a worthwhile goal. Austerity, it may not be that. In austerity, the motive may be just philosophical, because it can be a philosophical concept also that trying to do with as little as possible is a worthwhile, useful thing to do. It helps in living a happier life. This can be arrived at just as a mental exercise by a wise person, and so it becomes just a philosophical concept. It can also be an expression of the sattvic ego. Manojda used to tell a story that once he had gone to attend an international conference, and there he was staying in a 5-star hotel. That is what the organizers had provided, and another friend of his had also been provided another room in the same 5-star hotel. Now this person went on telling the people at the reception, telling the organizers, and telling everybody. He was sort of say it loudly at every possible place to try and tell everybody that I'm not comfortable living in this 5-star hotel, because I don't need the air conditioning, I don't need the refrigerator, I don't want the television, I don't want this and that in my room. So the organizers are unnecessarily wasting money on providing me this. I would have been much happier living in a much simpler hotel. And finally, he became so troublesome to them that they shifted him to a simpler hotel, a less expensive hotel. And then he overheard the organizer say that this person thinks that he's saving us a lot of money by shifting to a simpler hotel. But actually, now we have to spend a lot on providing him a cab or a taxi to bring him from this new hotel to the venue of the conference, because the conference was going on in the 5-star hotel. So we have to transport him, we have to spend more money than the money that we were spending. It's more difficult for us to organize that. Now, what this person could have done simply was, if he was so simple by habit, he need not have used the TV and the fridge and the telephone and whatever was provided in the room. He could have just not used it. It was not compulsory that he had to use it. But then this making an exhibition of this was an expression of the sattvic ego. So sattva also has an ego. Sattva, is the principle of knowledge and harmony. In the Gita, there are three basic principles, psychological principles, which constitute our personality in varying proportions. Tamas is inertia or laziness. Rajas is about kinetic activity and ambitions and desires. And sattva, the highest of these, is about knowledge and harmony. So, but knowledge and harmony is also not free from ego. So this person was manifesting that sattvic ego, which a person feels is an expression of nobility. It's a good principle, but then it also has an ego, and even that is not desirable. And one can go one step further. The ascetic austerities of deliberately torturing oneself. That can be actually not because of spiritual motives necessarily, but it could be out of vanity. Because then you can exhibit and say that, see, this is how little on which I can live, and this is the type of torture, extremes of heat and cold or prolonged fast and so on, that I can undergo. So that becomes an ego boost for the person. It is an expression of vanity rather than being on the spiritual path. So tapas is essentially about concentration of energy. And if it is austerity, then it is austerity with a particular motive. Austerity because I want to reserve my energy for what is really worthwhile. And the only worthwhile goal on the spiritual path is union with the divine. So it is for the sake of the divine that I have eliminated from my life those things which can be an obstacle, which can distract me. And that is why my life has become simple. So tapas is essentially concentration of energy. So tapas does lead to simplicity because then the needs are limited, but all simplicity is not tamas. Sorry, all simplicity is not tapas. Simplicity can be the result of the sattvic ego. It can be the result of vanity or a false pride in showing that I can do what very few can do. I can go through the difficulties and torture which most people would not be able to do. So that type of simplicity is not tapas. So tapas, simplicity is a corollary of tapas, concentration of energy on what I'm really interested in. So tapas can lead to and does lead to a lot of simplicity, but all simplicity does not necessarily mean that it is tapas. Now we come to the fourth limb. So not fourth limb, the fourth amongst the 5 niyamas. That's the fourth among the rules in rajayoga. That is swadhyaya. Swa means self and adhyaya means study. So literally swadhyaya means self-study. And even if we translate it as self-study, that is trying to learn on one's own, it would be quite okay because self-taught is best taught. Nobody can teach anything to anybody else. Essentially, it's the student who learns. Sri Aurobindo has said that the first principle of teaching is that nothing can be taught. Now, what it means is that you cannot really teach anything to somebody unless the student is willing to learn. So it's more the student who learns rather than the teacher who teaches. So it can mean just that. But here it can mean something else. And that is what probably Patanjali meant. Studying oneself could mean trying to understand who I am. That is studying oneself. Who am I? Trying to answer that basic question, and we shall go into it in much greater detail in one of the subsequent sessions. But when a person tries to understand himself, who he is, he discovers that he is nothing but the divine. He is an imperfect manifestation of the divine, but he is the divine itself in another form. And not only he, so is all the rest of the creation. And through that, he realizes oneness with the rest of the creation. So that is what studying oneself leads to. So study of the self with a small s, that is the self which we ordinarily think we are, that is identifying oneself with the body and the mind, that is the small self with the small s, the body and the mind. But then by studying that self through self-study, that is on one's own, finally leads to the discovery of the self with the capital S, that is what we truly are. So just that little change from a small s to a capital S makes all the difference. The self with the small s means oneself as the body and the mind. That is what we ordinarily tend to identify ourselves with. But then the self with the capital S means what I truly am, that is a manifestation of the divine, and so is everybody else. So the self with the capital S is the same for everybody and all creation. And the fifth among the niyamas is Ishwar Pranidhana. Ishwara is God or the divine, and Pranidhana means attention to, surrender to, or love for. In short, Pranidhana means being aware of the divine, and if one is aware of the divine, then one would also realize the greatness of the divine. And if one realizes the greatness of the divine, one would willingly and cheerfully surrender to the divine, and would also develop an immense amount of love and adoration for the divine. So that would automatically follow. So basically, it's a question of becoming aware of the divine, and awareness of the divine comes from the previous limb, that is Swadhyaya. So you can see that one follows the other. Understanding oneself, that is Swadhyaya, Swadhyaya would automatically also lead to the previous three, that is Shaucha, Tapas, and Santosh. So they will also automatically follow, because it's basically all that issues from this understanding the deeper truths of existence. Therefore, if Swadhyaya is complete, one would automatically start seeing the divine everywhere and become aware of the presence of the divine. Now, why should we be aware of the presence of the divine all the time? Lord Krishna also says in the Gita, at all times, remember me. Sri Aurobindo also has said, behave as if the mother is always watching you, because indeed she is. Now, why this emphasis on remembering the divine all the time, being conscious of the presence of the divine all the time, which in turn would lead to, of course, surrender and adoration of the divine. But why this emphasis? Is Lord Krishna also exhibiting some sort of a vanity when he says, remember me all the time? Is he getting some satisfaction from people remembering Lord Krishna? No, actually, it's not for Lord Krishna. It's not for him. It's not for the divine that we have to remember the divine or be conscious of the divine. It is for ourselves. Because what does it do? Constant remembrance of the divine keeps us away from evil. To give you an example, suppose a young boy starts smoking. He doesn't smoke in front of his father. When his father is around, even if he's taken unawares, he quickly hides the cigarette. Why does he do that? Because he knows it is wrong to smoke, and I should not be doing it in the presence of someone whom I respect, whom I love, whom I fear. So in the same way, if we respect, if we love, if we fear the divine, being constantly aware of the presence of the divine will keep us away from evil. So by and large, we try and do things which are wrong when nobody is watching. And if we remember that even when nobody is watching, the divine always is, as Sri Aurobindo said, the mother always is watching you, we will keep away from evil. So not just depending upon the voice of our own psychic being, we would also be aware of the divine watching us from everywhere, not just from within, from our psychic being, and it will become easier for us to follow the guidance provided by the psychic being if we are aware of the presence of the divine everywhere all the time. So constant remembrance of the divine keeps us away from evil. What else does it do? It also gives us the courage to do what is right. Because in some cases, if it's not outright evil, we at least need a lot of courage. Because the choices provided by the psychic being are based on love. Love is expressed by giving. And sometimes giving certain things needs a lot of courage. We are not willing to do it. Or it involves a risk. And because doing good can also be risky. So where does that courage come from? Courage to give what we are not feeling like parting with, courage to do what is risky just because it is right. Where does that courage come from? That courage again comes from the divine, because the divine is not only all-knowing, but also all-powerful. Because of the all-knowing character of the divine, we know what is right. That is what the psychic being tells us. But then it is because of the all-powerful nature of the divine, that we also acquire the courage to do it. So that strength comes from there. So we can transcend the limitations of our limited self. It is the limitation of the little self that we do not have enough courage to do it sometimes. But when we are constantly aware of the divine, constantly remembering the divine, that courage automatically comes. So we get the right guidance, and we also get the courage to translate that guidance into action. If it requires courage, then we acquire that courage also to do it. Even if we find that all our friends and well-wishers are telling us not to do it, we still do it, because we can stand up to the whole world if necessary to do what is right, because now we have that strength, that power which comes from the divine. So constant remembrance of the divine, being aware of the divine all the time, also gives us the courage to do what is right. And if the world is full of all types of peril, all types of dangers, all types of difficulties, and we often find ourselves inadequate to cope with them, what gives us a sense of security is again the remembrance of the divine. Because for the divine, everything is simple, no difficulty is too great, and therefore we get a sense of security from the constant remembrance of the divine. We feel secure, we know that this higher power, this higher force is always with us. And in spite of everything, we can have difficulties in life, and sometimes traumatic events, what we call misfortunes. Reconciliation with them becomes easier if we constantly remember the divine, because awareness of the divine makes a surrender to the divine will and wisdom, and a formula better than surrender to the divine will and wisdom is yet to be written for reconciling with all the ups and downs of life. So for dealing with all the ups and downs of life, the best formula invented so far is surrender to the divine. And that's why we have expression of it across tradition in all languages. Thine will be done. It's all divine will. So I have to reconcile with it. Thine will be done. Prabhu Ichha, if you call it in Hindi. Rab di Meher in Punjabi. Or Inshallah, whatever Allah wishes. So, these are all expressions of the same sentiment, surrender to the divine. And of course, surrender becomes easier if we are not reconciling with it just because it is divine will. That makes God look like a dictator. We have to do because he wants it, he's all powerful, he can do whatever he wants. But we surrender to it because we realize that the divine is not only all powerful, it is also all wise, knows everything about our past and future. And therefore, if in its wisdom it has decided to do it, there must be something good about it. So it is this trust in the divine wisdom that makes it easier for us to also accept the divine will. So it's a willful subordination of our own way of thinking to a better way of thinking, because we know our thinking is highly limited. It is the divine that knows all and therefore knows best what is best for us. So constant remembrance of the divine makes it easier for us to reconcile with misfortune, all the ups and downs of life, all the vicissitudes of life. So Ishwar Pranidhan is about all this. And with all that happening, if we are able to do what is right, only what is right, do it easily because we have the courage, we feel secure from all types of dangers in the world, and nothing can shock us. In fact, we can accept all unpleasant events, including the so-called misfortunes, with great delight because we take it as a gift from the divine. It has been given to us because it is best for us. Then what is there to make us miserable? Nothing. So we are in a state of bliss, the type of bliss which characterizes the divine, Ananda. We are in that Ananda. So this transports us to bliss. What the mother had described is perfect peace and serenity. So it is that blissful state that we get transported by constant remembrance of the divine. So by constantly aspiring to know the divine and to serve the divine better, by being constantly aware of its presence, transports us to a state of steady imperturbable bliss, something which cannot be shaken up by anything, which stays there no matter what. So you can see that these 5 rules or niyamas are closely related to the yamas or the don'ts, and also follow one from the other. Shaucha or cleanliness, keeping the surroundings clean. One of the important thing is conscious elimination of what we don't want, and aparigraha, which was one of the yamas, not collecting more objects than is necessary, closely related to it. So the last yama gets related to the first niyama. And then if we want less, we clean up everything, and we want less, we are contented. We are happy with what we have. And if all our attention and energy is now limited to the few possessions and concerns that we still have, only the feelings that are worth retaining, only the thoughts that are worth retaining, and only the objects which are necessary for us, we can concentrate all our effort and energy on what is really important to us. And all that becomes easy if we understand the deeper truths of existence. If we understand who we are, then Shaucha, Santosh, and Tapas would automatically follow. And once the person has done this self-study, he would start seeing the divine everywhere. So then the person can be constantly aware of the presence of the divine, that is Ishwar Pranidhana. So we have done the first of 2 of the 8 limbs in 2 sessions, Yama and Niyama. There are 6 more limbs, but we will not take 6 more sessions on them. We'll do asana through samadhi in 1 session related to meditation, and asana to dhyana, that is the 3rd to the 7th limb, are closely related to the technique of meditation, a very comprehensive technique of meditation. And samadhi, of course, is the product of the previous 7 limbs. Now let's have a look at a few questions before you ask questions. Yamas and niyamas develop self-control, lead to self-purification, make a person compassionate. All of the above are true. In fact, yamas and niyamas are a code of conduct for self-control and self-purification. So A and B are true. And when that happens, the person also becomes more compassionate. So that is also true. So all of the above are in fact true. That is the right answer. Okay. Now we go to a question which is a little more difficult than this. Yamas and niyamas are a philosophical introduction to Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. Now, when we say a philosophical introduction, it looks like a window dressing, something which is nice to read and, good as a preliminary. But in fact, yamas and niyamas are not just that. More than that, yamas and niyamas are something very practical. They are not just of academic value. They are not only of philosophical value. They are something to be practiced. So A cannot be the right answer. So let's see what are the other alternatives. The first 2 steps in Raja Yoga, and therefore completing them is a prerequisite for going further. Now, if that were so, it will become really very difficult, because yamas and niyamas in themselves can be more than a lifetime job. So if completing them is a prerequisite for going to the 3rd step of the asanas, none of us would be qualified to perform the yogasanas. And in fact, they are not the first 2 steps. That's why Patanjali doesn't call them steps. He calls them just limbs, anga, or parts, components. So they're not they are the first 2 limbs, not the first 2 steps. And to insist that they should be complete before we go further would be very unrealistic. See, important only for beginners. That is, when one is beginning on the path of yoga, then yes, yamas and niyamas are important. After he has made some progress, he can drop them. That is not true. And they should continue throughout. And in fact, they are themselves more than a lifetime job. So while doing the other limbs, this should also continue. And that will help the practice of the techniques, and the techniques would help in the practice of yamas and niyamas. So they would be complementary, but yamas and niyamas cannot be dropped at any stage in life. They're not only for beginners. The first 2 limbs of Ashtanga Yoga, without embarking on which going to the other limbs becomes difficult and meaningless. Now here, it's the first 2 limbs, not steps, and that is true. They are limbs, not steps, without embarking on which. Now, this option doesn't talk about completing them. embarking on them, making a beginning with them, starting on them, and continuing with them. Embarking refers to just starting and continuing, not completing, not reaching a state of perfection in these limbs, without embarking on which going to the other limbs becomes difficult and meaningless. Meaningless, certainly, yes, because then it doesn't remain a spiritual path anymore, but also difficult because these two will help in even the technique of meditation, because the surface activity of the mind should be silenced during the state of meditation, and that cannot happen without the yamas and niyamas, as we saw that it is the yamas and niyamas which create that feeling of security and bliss because of the remembrance of the divine and so on. So it becomes even difficult to practice a technique like meditation without embarking on the path of yama and niyama. So the right option is the last one. Yamas and niyamas are the first two limbs of Ashtanga Yoga, without embarking on which going to the other limbs becomes difficult and meaningless. Now here's an assertion and reason type of question. The assertion is, asanas cannot be done without practicing yamas and niyamas. And the reason given is, in Ashtanga Yoga, yamas and niyamas come before asanas. So to way to connect these two, to see whether the question makes sense, would be asanas cannot be done without practicing yamas and niyamas, because in Ashtanga Yoga, yamas and niyamas come before asanas. Now, you find that this somehow does not make full sense, because so many people do asanas without bothering about yamas and niyamas. So the assertion cannot be true. Asanas cannot be done without practicing yamas and niyamas. So it's a false statement, because people do asanas without bothering about yamas and niyamas. But if that is false, the reason actually becomes redundant, because you cannot have a correct reason, even if the reason is correct, supporting a wrong assertion. So in Ashtanga Yoga, yamas and niyamas come before asanas. Yes, they do come before, but that doesn't mean that asanas cannot be done without practicing yamas and niyamas. So the answer would be that the assertion is a false statement. The reason is a true statement. Now, if this question were a little altered, then this situation would change. If we say asanas should not be done without practicing yamas and niyamas, then it would become a true statement. And in Ashtanga Yoga, yamas and niyamas come before asanas. That would also be a true statement. Not only both would be true, then the reason would be a correct explanation for the assertion. Because sometimes, assertion and reason can be both true, but the reason may not be the correct explanation for the assertion. That is how we get a multiple choice question from this type of questions. So here, the assertion is false, the reason is true. So the question of the reason being an explanation or not doesn't arise. But if it was asanas should not be done without practicing yamas and niyamas, then the reason would be correct. In Ashtanga Yoga, yamas and niyamas come before asanas. Then both would be true statements, and the reason would be a true explanation for the assertion. These are things, these discussions are primarily for those who are educationists or who are actually teaching this type of subjects as a part of a formal course and examining students on those courses. So they could use this type of exercises to sharpen the students' thinking, as well as to provide good thought-provoking questions in the exams. Now, tapas is moderation, elimination, simplicity, self-torture. Now, people could look upon all these as reasonably correct. And that is what a good question is about. All the options should be plausible. But if you were to think about it, tapas is not just moderation for the sake of moderation. Elimination, yes, conscious elimination, so that energy is reserved for what we really want. Simplicity, yes, follows from tapas, but basically the process is not focused on simplicity. The process is focused on elimination so that the energy can be concentrated. And tapas certainly is not willful self-torture. So the best option of these four appears to be elimination. So tapas is essentially a process of elimination, conscious elimination of what is not necessary for reaching our goal. the one indispensable contributor to discovery of the self with a capital S, is studying the scriptures, listening to discourses, charity, grace of the divine. Now, people do all these things and sometimes even remain under the illusion that since I have studied so much, I go to so many discourses, I have so much knowledge as a result of this study and attending the discourses, that now I have become quite spiritual, I have discovered the self. But knowledge of the self at a mental level does not mean much. At the experiential level, it cannot be just the result of these things. The person also thinks that since I do quite a bit of charity, that will be my good karma, and therefore I have now understood and experienced the divine. But charity by itself also does not do that. And therefore, the most important option remains, the best option remains, grace of the divine. In fact, all personal effort is inadequate. And all what happens as a result of personal effort is earning divine grace. But it is ultimately the grace that does it. There is a little joke on that. Once a person, after he died, he went up, and at the gate to heaven, there was that angel who wanted to make sure that whether he's fit to enter heaven. So he was asked, what all did you do in life on earth to deserve entry to heaven? He said, well, I was married to the same woman for 50 years and I continued to love her till the end. Okay, 2 points for that. And he was told that you have to earn 100 points to be able to enter heaven. So for being married to the same woman for 20 years and continuing to love her till the end, 2 points. I did such and such act of charity, 1 point for that. Then he said that I provided blankets to some people shivering in the cold. Okay, 2 points for that. So he said, at this rate, I think I'll never get into heaven without divine grace. The angel said, now you are in. You are free to enter heaven. So ultimately, the entry to heaven came through divine grace. So when he realized that, then he was allowed entry to heaven. So the divine grace remains important. And what is grace? Grace essentially is the gift from the divine out of infinite love that the divine has for us. The difference between a gift and a prize. A prize has to be earned through effort. A gift is given just out of love. Grace is a gift. It is not a prize. Earning the grace, being open to the grace can be a prize, but the final result comes out of the love that the divine has for us. So in that sense, it is a gift. Now, another question. The assertion is, it is impossible to practice yoga without believing in God. And the reason given is, an Ashtanga yoga, Ishwar Pranidhana, being devoted to the divine, is one of the Niyamas. Now, the first assertion, it is impossible to practice yoga without believing in God, is strictly speaking not true. Because firstly, when it comes to the techniques of meditation like asanas and pranayamas, techniques of yoga, they are practiced by many people without believing in God. Self-perfection is an idea which does not require belief in God. Anybody can aim at trying to become better than the person is and moving towards perfection. And to some extent, if the person really follows this path of self-perfection without even believing in God, gradually the person will move towards a point where the person may start believing in God. But the practice itself does not depend upon believing in God, because the process is not dependent on belief in God. The process would happen irrespective of the belief. So that inner change is going on in the person even without believing in God, even if the person is practicing those things without believing in God, because Yamas, Niyamas and all that we have talked about, particularly Yama and Niyama, those are things which, except for Ishwar Pranidhan, everything else could be done by a person without believing in God. Even trying to understand who I am can be a philosophical exercise. And there have been philosophers who have tried to just philosophize on this as a cerebral exercise to understand who we are. So therefore, it is possible to practice yoga without believing in God. Although if the person has gone to the stage of Swadhyaya sincerely, chances are that he'll start believing in God, so he'll be converted. And it has happened to many of our great sages and seers who have not started believing in God just because everybody says so. They started with skepticism, but an open mind. And when they went on their own spiritual journey, finally they discovered the divine and started believing in the divine. In fact, that will not called a belief, that would then be called knowledge of the divine. So believing in what one knows is more than believing. It's not believing just for the sake of belief. It is because the person knows. But anyway, so it is possible to practice yoga without believing in God. So assertion is not strictly speaking a true statement, it's a false statement. The reason, of course, is true that in Ashtanga Yoga, Ishwar Pranidhan is one of the Niyamas. So once again, the assertion is a false statement. It is possible to practice yoga without believing in God. The reason is a true statement. In Ashtanga, Ishwar Pranidhan is one of the Niyamas. Now, if it is possible to practice yoga without believing in God, and eventually the person may even discover God through Swadhyaya, then how is it starting with faith in the divine? Faith is, without knowledge. Belief can be a mental belief, but faith is more than a mental belief. Faith is actually belief in God, even in spite of not having the knowledge. So belief is more than mental. It is just an inner sort of a feeling and assertion, accepting it as something axiomatic without question, that there is a God, and experience may verify it. Being open to that experience, but not having any doubts. One can have questions, but one doesn't have doubts. One can question a God, but one cannot doubt the existence of God. So there's a shade of a difference. So why is it that faith in the divine, how is it help, even before having the personal experience? If one were to go over sort of one valid, sort of strictly valid reason why faith in the divine helps a person on the path of yoga, is that it makes the journey more pleasant. It makes the journey more enjoyable. Because one then can leave a lot to the divine. One can leave the progress on the path to the divine. One can leave everything except personal effort to the divine, because it is ultimately the divine grace that will take care of it. Our personal effort is just because we have to earn the divine grace. So it becomes another thing place where it helps is in the ups and downs of life. A person may be on a good path, maybe a good person, but if it is only at the level of the mind, the person is not well equipped to deal with all the ups and downs of life. Because being a good person does not make this person immune to all types of difficulties in life, like a road accident or an incurable illness or a failed marriage. He is still vulnerable to all these, and what can help the person is faith in the divine, and therefore taking all this as an expression of the divine will and wisdom. Otherwise, the person will just keep asking, why me? Why is it happening to me? The person can't understand. I'm such a good person. I'm doing all this, and yet this is happening to me. And if the person truly is very skeptical and doubting, then the person may, in fact, the person's faith in the divine may get shaken up, and he may, in fact, start thinking about doing any good any further. So all that can happen if the person does not have faith in the divine. So if he can't cope with the ups and downs of life. He may end up doing a lot of good to the world, but he himself remains miserable because the ups and downs of life still continue to be there. And therefore, believing in God is not necessary for the process of spiritual growth to happen. The process will go on independently of the person's belief. But the person himself will not be in that state of peace and bliss, which we were talking about, without believing in the divine. But the process is not dependent upon belief. To give a crude example, if a person jumps from the 4th floor of a building, his falling with a thud does not depend upon his belief in gravity. The person can't get away with it just by saying, I don't believe in gravity. If he jumps, he will still fall. So the process does not depend upon belief. The process depends upon what the person is doing, not on his belief. So the process can go on even in a good person who does not believe in God, but the person is not aware of it. The person doesn't look at it the same way as the one who believes in God, and therefore this person may be doing a lot of good to the world, but remains vulnerable to all the shocks and difficulties of life. An event-free, shock-free life can come only through belief in the divine. Now, the suggested readings, the chapter on Raja Yoga and a primer on yoga, about 40 pages, which covers all the Yamas, Niyamas, and the remaining 6 limbs. And in the synthesis of yoga, an introductory introductory passages on Raja Yoga from pages 35 to 37, and a more detailed treatment later in part 2, chapter 28, pages 536 to 542, and the synthesis of yoga and all the complete works of Sri Aurobindo are available for free download on the website of Sri Aurobindo Ashram Pondicherry, sriaurobindoashram.org. And this new book, Spiritual Wisdom in Small Doses, has an essay on all these things that we have talked about, an essay on Raja Yoga, and an essay on each of the Yamas and Niyamas. This is arranged in alphabetical order, so very easy to find. And this book is also available for free download on the website yesspirituality.wordpress.com. This is the place where I live and work, and you're all welcome here. In addition to questions and comments that we are able to take up in these sessions, you are always free to write your questions also to sa150yes@gmail.com. The gratitude to the Master and the Mother for their grace, which is making these sessions possible. Thank you. I can see 2 hands there, and I'm sure so can Aditi. Now
yes,
3
Sonika,
hands.
you can go ahead.
Yeah,
Yes.
namaste, sir.
Namaste.
Sir, I have a question. So we talk of replacing negative emotions such as hatred and anger with love and forgiveness. But simultaneously, we also talk about, justice prevailing. And that's probably why Sri Krishna, that's how he directed Arjuna to continue with the war. Now, suppose A kills B and B's family is set out to take revenge. There's a woman who has been subjected to domestic violence and she's set out to take revenge. Unless that fire of these two feelings, hatred and revenge, is kept alive, how can one fight for justice? So either of the two can happen. Either you just explain to yourself and be at peace, or you keep this fire burning and let the justice prevail.
That's what makes the spiritual path difficult, apparently more difficult than the ordinary normal way of thinking, which makes revenge very justifiable in these situations. But if you remember, in one of the previous sessions where I think, yes, in the last one only, where we were talking about ahimsa, we saw, how Lord Krishna justified violence in the Gita. So it's not that violence cannot be justified, but it was the spirit behind the violence which was emphasized by Lord Krishna. That yes, you should protect justice, and for that, if violence is necessary, indulge in that violence, but do it without hatred for the enemy. Which means that the negative emotion like hatred, which in turn leads to the fire of revenge, as you called it, that has to be overcome. Even without that, one can do it. So how to do it without that is the difficult part, and that is what makes the spiritual path difficult. And also that is what makes the spiritual path more meaningful, because then it remains not just a personal battle, but something which is contributing to making the world a better place, raising the consciousness of the human race itself. So it becomes its implications become much wider. And also what happens as a result of this is then it becomes possible to stay detached from the outcome of that violence. That outcome is not for personal gain, it is not for revenge, it is for a higher principle. So how to pick up that battle from that higher principle? So outwardly, it still remains that battle, but the motive behind the battle changes from revenge and hatred to fulfilling the purpose of one's own life and raising the consciousness of the surroundings.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you. Maybe in the last question we can add the word assertivity. Assertivity could help in that situations. My question is about Ahankar. What is the difference between Ahankar and Ahankaram? They are very close root, the word, isn't it? Thank you.
They are the same. Ahankara and Ahankaram, they are the same.
But Ahankaram is the ego, isn't it? It's a personal ego.
Yes, ego, but sort of some of the undesirable aspects of the ego, which is arrogance, that is considering oneself superior to others because of some unique talents and gifts or achievements which the person has experienced. So that makes the person feel that I'm superior to the others. So having that sense of superiority, developing a sense of hierarchy in your mind, that is what arrogance is about.
But if you have a word for unifying the outer being, can you use Ahankaram?
No.
How do you say the unifying outer being? Mental, vital, and physical, a gross body.
Unification is yoga. Oneness is ekatva. Ekatva. Ekatva is oneness.
Can you spell it, please?
Ekatva. In English, probably it will be E-K-A-T-V-A. Ekatva. Ekatva is oneness.
Thank you.
Yes, Prasant.
Actually, I have a question on that Swadhyaya. Swadhyaya means, what I know is that Adhyaya, that study. But in some other sources, I have got that Swadhyaya means especially reading of scriptures or some holy books also comes under Swadhyaya. So is it true? And can you just connect it with that satsang also, please?
I deliberately kept that away because reading scriptures, some have even gone to the extent of saying that reciting the name of the divine again and again, that is japa, that is also swadhyaya. Now, whether it is japa, reciting the name again and again, or whether it is reading the scriptures or attending discourses, these can all facilitate swadhyaya, but that alone will not lead to the discovery of the true self. And that is what one of the mantras in the Upanishads also says. I can't remember, that it is not through study and discussion and all that, lectures and all that, that the divine can be realized. The divine can be realized only by the one who has been chosen by the divine. So, he who chooses the infinite has been chosen by the infinite. So it is essentially a readiness to receive, which is the result of all that the person has done in all the previous lives, that eventually makes the person entitled to that self-discovery through his own personal quest. The rest is all are aids and facilitators. So just to say that japa is what Swadhyaya means is an oversimplification.
About satsanga.
Satsang comes to the same thing. Satsang in good company. So a collective sort of a consciousness of a large number of people, like-minded people, the way even we are here in this big classroom. So any type of community feeling, gathering, where the collective consciousness of people on the same path comes together, and all of them are aspiring towards a higher consciousness, that does create those vibrations, which has great power. The mother said that if more than 12 people sit and meditate anywhere together, that itself becomes a very powerful force in realizing what they are aspiring for.
On the similar lines, we have this one question in the chat box. Bhakti Yoga says, repeat the name of God every moment. What does Sri Aurobindo or the mother say to remember the divine every moment?
Yes, as I said, I mean, Sri Aurobindo has said that you behave as if the mother is always watching you, because she is. So that comes to the same thing. But at the same time, in Sri Aurobindo and the mother's yoga, you will find that there is no one simplistic, exclusive technique that has been suggested as the totality of what needs to be done to progress on the spiritual path. So japa has a place, everything has a place. There is hardly anything that cannot find a place within integral yoga, and yet nothing by itself will appear like a shortcut, a simplistic thing, which you just do this much and everything will happen to you. Need not do anything else. That type of approach doesn't exist in integral yoga. We'll come to integral yoga also after a few days. And in fact, there'll be many sessions by different speakers. So I think all that would bring out some of these aspects of integral yoga, which is extremely comprehensive, allows a lot of freedom, does not impose any particular techniques, and provides no shortcuts, because there is no shortcut in yoga.
Is there just one more question?
Can I share something, sir? Can I?
Yeah, sure, please go ahead.
Yeah. First of all, thank you so much for providing this platform, sir. And I've been learning and doing yoga from past 12 years. But the way sir is explaining to us and so deeply he's going, so it feels so nice to be connected with you. And I feel blessed. 10 years back, I had gone to Pondicherry and I visited the ashram. So today I feel very lucky and proud. I'm just sharing and I'm learning and from you. I'm very blessed and lucky to be and hearing from sir, and mother. Blessings of mother is always there with us. So I just wanted to share this. Okay, now I feel 10 years down the lane I had gone, and I don't know, now this course just came. It is like, something you just have a cake in your hand and you want to learn that. So thank you so much. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm only a channel. You're not learning from me, you're learning from the master and the mother. I'm only a channel to pass on a bit of what I'm capable of. And you said 10 years down the lane. So again, when the right time comes, the circumstances rearrange themselves. So the circumstances rearrange. That's how this course happened, and you came to know about it.
Yes, sir. Thank you
Where
so much.
Do you stay in Delhi or somewhere else?
I'm at Mumbai. Sir. I'm a
Great.
yoga therapist, sir. Just finished Ayush Ministry yoga therapist exam in October. But the thing is, the more I'm learning, the more I'm listening. Every time I feel I don't know one thing. I don't know this, I don't know that. So yoga is so vast. Every time we are listening from any speaker, we feel we don't know this. We have to learn so much in life. That's the, fun of yoga. That's the depth of yoga. We want to learn, and it never ends. Learning is not ending.
Thank you, Rachna. Thank you for all
Thank you.
those comments, because yes, awareness of our own ignorance, how much more remains to be learned, is itself a great step to knowledge.
All right, then I think we can end. We don't have any more questions. Tomorrow's session will be the practical session, day 3. And like always, we end with a silent meditation. And then you can quietly leave the meeting. Thank you, everyone.